There, the rest of us, I have you get out your Bibles, go with me to Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8 this morning. We're going to finish up Luke chapter 8, which has been, this will be our fourth week in the chapter and kind of dealing with a series within a series. So we've been in the Gospel of Luke for a long time now, and we'll continue through the whole account. But in particular, Luke chapter 8, Luke, the Gospel writer, almost takes a pause in chronology of what's going on in the Gospel and pairs together three different thematic events that all work to answer a question that I think is on the minds and the hearts of many in our culture. And it's, what do you do with a God who exists in the midst of a world that experiences disaster and pain and disease and death? How do you reconcile those two things? In fact, I remember a few years back, I had not yet, when I got out of college, I worked as a financial advisor at a bank. I hadn't made a transition yet into the world of vocational ministry where this was just my job. And so I began to volunteer. And the only place that they wanted me as a volunteer was in youth ministry, and in particular youth outreach ministry, because they felt like maybe I could do the least amount of damage there. I don't know. But they asked me to go spend time with 6th to 12th grade students. And where we were located, we ran buses into a bunch of communities to pick up a bunch of these students once a week and bring them into the church and run this program where we would allow them to have a lot of fun. We would care for them, we'd feed them, and then we'd share the gospel with them. And it was a way to just kind of connect and share with some students. Now, I had to drive one of the buses. If you've seen me drive, that in itself is a scary enough idea. But they gave me the bus driver's license and said, hey, go drive this and pick up these kids. And I don't know how this happened, but I swear they must have take applications for kids that if you had been suspended from school enough or you were a bad enough kid, you could ride on my bus. But if you were better, they'd put you on a different bus. So every week it seemed like I pick up 60 kids in this bus and just fill this thing with the most rowdy, rambunctious, out of control, and sometimes really devious and terrible and frustrating kids that you can imagine. And every week I pick them up and we just pray. In fact, I think I got more vocal and active in prayer than any other time in my life, because every week I get on the bus and just pray that we would survive. I just pray, please don't let there be a fight that gets out of control. Please don't let some kid get thrown out of a bus window. Please let the brakes work. Just a whole bunch of stuff that you had to pray and hope that it would happen. And so in particular, I remember for a year, there was a kid that I picked up who was in high school. His name was also Nick, and I picked him up. He was the first person I picked up and the last person I dropped off on this route. He was 16 years old at the time, and he was peak amongst the problems. He was, him and one or two other kids, it seemed like every week was a problem. Now, for some of you, you would go, well, why do you keep picking this kid up? Because he was like my favorite. I loved the problems. I was all about that, and I kind of related well to that personality. And so we would have this kind of really good relationship and then really bad relationship. The relationship would be good when him and I were having fun, and he was kind of this jovial personality, and then he'd punch a kid, and the relationship would go bad for a week or two, and then it would get better again, and that was just sort of how it went. Well, amongst the things that he had trouble with was he came from a pretty rough background, and so it made him really want to be a tough kid. He really wanted to defend his pride and his honor, and so you just didn't see a lot of emotion from him outside of anger. Well, I remember one week I picked him up and really I think it was kind of a week where we were at odds a little bit more than in the past. The week before he had some issues, and so I wasn't really happy with him. We do the bus route, we drop him off, we spend the night with him, and at the very end of the night, he gets in a fight and hits another kid, and so we decide that he needs to sit in the very front seat of the bus going home and just has to sit there, and I'm supposed to monitor him while I drive the bus, and so we take all this time, drop off all these kids, and all along he's just kind of agitating things. Now, if you have kids, you have no idea what it's like to have kids just do agitating things, right? Just to see if they can get a rise out of you. Well, he's sitting in the front row just doing this stuff that he's trying to make me angry, trying to make me upset. And so finally, like I said, first kid we pick up, last kid we drop off, we get all the other kids off the bus, and I pulled the bus over, and I stopped, and I said, I'm not driving you home. And he looked at me and he was like, what are you even talking about? I said, I'm not going anywhere until we talk. What is this? He goes, well, yesterday, my sister overdosed on heroin. And this kid, who was as tough a kid I ever met, began to cry. Just me, him, an empty school bus. And he looked at me and he said, you're always talking about God. I said, how can there be a God who's in control of things and lets that happen? He's asking a question that if you've lived some time, you've had to deal with. The reason is because no matter who you are, you have to deal with pain. You have to deal with death. You have to deal with tragedy. And so he asks this question, and then he begins to work through it, talking about it in the way that the world gives us as solutions. He says either there is no God because God couldn't be in control of that. All this evil just exists and God doesn't have the ability to stop it. Well, that's not God. If he just lets this stuff happen, if he just can't stop this stuff, then there certainly can't be a God that you talk about. And then he goes, or maybe he was there. He had some words that we won't say on a Sunday, but he says, maybe this God wanted my sister to die. Maybe this God was making these things happen. And he looked at me, he goes, which one is it? Because I don't want either of them. And I remember us conversing that morning. And I took him to this chapter, Luke chapter 8. And there on the side of the road on a school bus, we began to walk through and describe the scriptures that we're going to look at this morning. I said, look at how the Bible talks about God in the midst of problems. It starts with Jesus in a boat with his disciples and a storm that comes that would have certainly killed the disciples. Describes a storm that was so large, so perilous, so problematic that a whole bunch of fishermen on a boat fear for their very lives. And Jesus then calms the storm, right? It continues on. And this morning, what we see is not only in times of natural disaster, not only in times of difficulty in the midst of a storm or something, in the midst of evil, as the Bible continues, they find a man on the other side of the lake, and there Jesus comes and he's demon-possessed. And Jesus casts out demons, but then the account continues. And from natural disaster to the demonic, it begins to tell us an account of two things this morning that we want to look at: disease and death. And I said, here's what Luke is doing. He's helping you answer this question. He's helping you give the answer to the question, how does God allow for such pain, such problems, such difficulties to exist? What would he do? And I said something to the effect of God allows and even ordains this evil, this disease, this death, this disaster for a time in order to show us his character and his glory, to show us who he is and so that you might have a chance to know him. Let me show you how Luke does this, okay? So pick up with me in verse 40. If you remember from a couple weeks ago, there's a man in the land of the Gentiles who has been cured of a legion of demons. The demons cast out of him, just kind of a wild interaction in Scripture. And following it, the people of that land go, leave. We don't want any part of you because this scares us. And so Jesus takes the man who is healed, sends him into that land as a missionary, and obeys. He leaves these people. And so it picks up and says, Jesus returned. And the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. Great crowds there. And it says, there came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue. And he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. So, before we get into the details of the interaction, let me deal with this. We look today and kind of try to answer this question: where is God in the midst of disease? Where is God in the midst of death? Where is God in the midst of this pain, this difficulty, these things that we look at and go, this is evil, or this is painful, or this is wrong, or this hurts? Where is God in those things? And we believe that Luke is trying to point out, God is trying to point out through his word, the answer to this question is that God is right there. That not only is he there, but he allows and sometimes even ordains these things for the sake of introducing us to his character and his glory. And so that for a time there might be these things so that we might know him well and experience more of who he is, experience more of his character. And so there's a couple things you got to deal with. First, why does evil, pain, death exist in the first place? And here's the answer of that time. It's because of sin, which is correct. And then here's how they would answer it. So if you have sinned, you face disease, pain, death, evil. And if you were righteous, you wouldn't endure those things. The theology was one of prosperity given based on the way that you lived. And so those of you who lived a bad life were receiving the result of your bad life in your sin. And those who lived a good life were receiving the result of their good life in their prosperity. And Jesus comes onto the scene and says, it doesn't work that way. John chapter 9 introduces us to an interaction where Jesus sees a man who is blind from birth, and his own disciples, kind of buying into this train of thought, go, who sinned to cause this? Was it his sin or was it his parents' sin? And Jesus says it was neither, but so that the glory of God might be demonstrated. In fact, Luke chapter 8 here, this interaction is going to challenge their very train of thought, because the common thought of the day, and really you can look into our culture and find it's about the same. The belief system amongst our people is that if you do the right things, good things will happen to you, and if you do the wrong things, bad things will happen to you. And all of that makes sense until someone that you know as righteous and faithful and walking with the Lord gets cancer. All that makes sense until someone that you know who is devout and in love with Jesus dies well before their time. All this makes sense until it happens to you. And so Jesus is going to, in a simple interaction, correct a generation of poor theology, a fullness amongst the world that we believe that we somehow control these things, and reintroduce it as God who is the one who's in control. Here's how. This interaction describes two people. One, his name is Jairus. The Bible tells us he's a synagogue leader. That meant he was an upright man. That meant in this time, the people around them would look at him, see him as important, see him as valuable, see him as righteous, see him as someone deserving of praise, deserving of help, deserving of a cure. When he comes to Jesus and says, my daughter, my 12-year-old daughter is dying, come and help. The crowds that had gathered around would have looked at that and said, certainly if anyone is deserving of this help, It's Jairus. So go, Jesus, go. And then, as he begins to travel, the Bible introduces us to a second person. She's not even mentioned by name, just a woman who has had a hemorrhage, a bleeding disease for years. 12 years to be exact. And it cannot be, as the Bible tells us in verse 43, healed by anyone. Mark adds the notation that she had even spent all of her resources, all of her money and energy on various doctors. Somebody find a solution, and no one could. What made it far worse was, in this culture, a disease like that would have been seen as deserved, and it would have made them unclean. A disease like that would have meant that amongst Jews, you could not touch this woman. Couldn't share a meal with her, couldn't be at a table with her because she was ceremonially unclean. It would have made her a social outcast. All of the things that Jairus would have so-called been deserving of, this woman would have been deserving of none of it. All of the reasons that the crowds would have said, yes, go, fix his daughter, heal her, make sure she's okay. They would have looked at this woman and said, well, certainly God has given this in result of her sin, her pain. Her problems were because she did something to deserve it. For all of the nature of these people, we see Jesus reacting in a way that would have been entirely opposite of what the crowds would have expected. We see Jesus indiscriminate amongst one who the social society of the time would have said is deserving of his hand of healing, and one who would have been entirely undeserving. One who would have been important and one who was not. And yet, the interaction goes on. Verse 44 says, the woman came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his cloak. And immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And look at the interaction. Jesus said, who is the one who touched me? Asking a question, and Jesus does this often. If you read the Gospels, he asks these questions, and we kind of have a tendency to forget that he's the Son of God. Like, he already knows the answer to the question, right? So he knows what's going on, and he doesn't allow it to simply pass by under the radar. In fact, one of the maybe more easy things to do was just to say he had healed this woman, and to leave it alone so that this woman could be brought back into the fellowship of her community as being one who is clean, without the embarrassment of saying, for the last 12 years she's had a disease that has made her unclean, or without the controversy of saying, why did you heal her? Instead, Jesus asks the question to bring it out and say, you won't go unnoticed. Who touched me? Then the scripture, this is awesome. If you follow Peter's life at all, you just see this kind of insertion here. It says, while they were denying it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you. He goes, dude, have you seen the crowd? Like, what do you mean, who touched you? Like, you're pushing your way through people. What do you mean, who touched you? Jesus is quick to remind, well, I'm the Son of God. I'm not saying who touched me. I'm saying someone did touch me, for I was aware that power had gone out of me. And when the woman had saw that she had not escaped notice, she came trembling and fell down before him and declared in the presence of all the people the reason why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Then the Bible continues on with the interaction. Verse 49 says, while he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. Can you imagine the crowds? Can you imagine the thought process that's happening now? The one who was deserving in their minds has missed it because he stopped and took time with one who wasn't deserving. The one who they looked at and went, if you're going to heal anybody, you ought to heal this guy's daughter, has in their mind missed out because Jesus was willing to pause for some woman who deserved this. Well, the story goes on. Jesus heard this, and he answered him, "Do not be afraid any longer. Only believe, and she will be made well." When he came to the house, he didn't allow anyone to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the girl's father and mother. Now, they were all weeping and lamenting for her, but he said, "Stop weeping, for she has not died, but is asleep." They began laughing at him, knowing that she had died. Imagine the tension in that interaction. And he, however, took her by the hand and called, saying, "Child, arise." And her spirit returned, and she got up immediately. And he gave orders for something to be given to her to eat. And her parents were amazed, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. As we zoom out of this and look at this interaction, I want to just point out a couple things. Because at the time, in that society, in that culture, this interaction would have turned the very nature of what they believed on its head. What was Jesus trying to do? What does God want us to know in the midst of disease and death? And in particular, why does Luke include this in this aspect of the story? Well, I think there's a few reasons, but here's the first thing. I think we ought to know and be comforted in the midst of, because the reality is many of us are walking through these times where we're experiencing some of these things. Jesus is trying to get some things across to us. The first is that Jesus is accessible to all people. Jesus is available to all. It would have made a lot of sense for them to see Jesus respond to Jairus, the synagogue leader, and say, "Surely I will come to your house." After all, he was religious. He was a staple in society. He was one that Jesus should respond to. However, in the very midst of it, a woman that would have been devalued by just about everybody in that culture receives a healing from Jesus, and not just silently, but Jesus stops for the opportunity to teach. And that's entirely contrary to the culture then, and even now. You know, a year and a half ago, we had this kind of cool opportunity. My brother is in the Secret Service, and so he was graduating from the Secret Service. So we went out to Washington, D.C., spent some time out there just kind of visiting and seeing stuff, and wanted to introduce our kids to stuff. Well, we have a friend who is also with the Secret Service, kind of helped my brother along, and has a relatively important role in the agency. And so I called him and said, "Hey, what should I do when I'm out in that area?" I knew he lived nearby, and he said, "Well, do you want to tour the White House?" It's like, yeah. And he goes, "Okay, would you want to tour the West Wing of the White House?" I was like, "You mean like the Oval Office? Like how close would we get?" He said, "I'll let you go and look inside the door of the Oval Office. You see just about everything." I said, "Absolutely, yeah. What do I have to do?" He said, "I'll send you the stuff." In my mind, that meant we would, sign up on the sheet, and the day came, we would come and do the tour, right? I get the paperwork. It's like 18 pages long. I'm not even kidding you. Name, address, last known address before that, different associations down to the 3rd and 4th degree, social security numbers for all of my kids, credit card information, No, I'm just on that part. But they want to know everything about you and run extensive background checks. You had to have them in by a certain time. And then when all of that came back, I had to go. We went there, but we had to be with him the entire time. And get this, our appointment time was 9:52 a.m. You're a minute late, you're not going. You're a minute early, you wait until your time. We get there, and outside of the very property grounds is a building that you had to go through, 3 different metal detectors, do a check. You have to walk past a ramp, and actually, as you're walking past, there's fans blowing on you and a grate behind you. And I said, "What is that for?" He said, "Well, that's where all the dogs are behind there, and they blow your scent so that the dogs can sniff you to make sure that..." The security checks were incredible. Why? Well, because important people aren't accessible. Because you, as much as you might want to or not want to, you simply can't walk into the president's office and have a conversation. You just can't. That's our culture, right? As you rise in importance, you distance, you make yourself less accessible. Can I tell you, one of the most incredible things about the good news of Jesus Christ is he's accessible and available to us, even though he's the God of the universe. Have you ever just stopped to think about that? That the God of the universe put on skin, came down. The Bible tells us that not only did he come, but he made himself lowly, the form of a bondservant, and became obedient even to the point of death on a cross so that we might have life. It tells us that we can draw near to the throne of grace in confidence because we have a high priest who sympathizes with our weakness. That God made a way for us not in our ability, but to the high and to the lowly. Jesus came offering salvation to a synagogue leader and a woman who is not even mentioned by name, that Jesus comes offering the same healing, the same restoration. I think there's another thing we need to know, though. Another thing that's important in this interaction, especially because what we often experience is different than what was experienced here. You see, I think we'd be naive and foolish to go, the beauty of Jesus is that he heals all disease. And the beauty of Jesus is that he stops all death. Because that's not what we experience. That's not reality. Many who are stricken with disease and pain and ailments and sickness will deal with it the whole of their life. For many, it will take their life. We experience death. If you've lived any time, you've experienced death of a young one, death of a loved one, death that just doesn't make sense. And so when we consider that, we ask, what is Jesus trying to teach us in the midst of this? What is Jesus trying to teach us in the midst of disease and death when here he heals? Well, I think a couple things. The first is that Jesus wants us to know that he has the power and authority to heal. That at the end of the day, we as a people, we as believers in Christ ought to know and follow the reality and the truth that Jesus has the power to heal, the power to restore, the power to change for the sake of his glory. That oftentimes you might look at a situation in your life or someone close to you and see dramatic change, see something healed, see something restored, see something different, and it's for the sake of you knowing and glorifying God. And here's the thing, as a Baptist church, that's something we just don't talk about very much. We have this ability to dismiss the work of God into things that are far more coincidental, far more natural, far more, well, yeah, the doctors did this or this happened or that happened. And what we do is we strip the very glory of a God who came to heal, who came to fix, who came to restore things. And what you ought to do is look at the things in your life or look at the things where you watch God working and be more willing to give him praise, be more willing to lift him up, be more willing to find his glory in those things. And then there's this other thing. You ever wonder why Jesus resurrected people from the dead only to see them die again? You ever think about that? I mean, this little girl died one day. Lazarus died. He's not in a church somewhere in the Middle East today. The widow's son in Nain, a couple chapters back, died again. So why does Jesus resurrect if they were just going to experience death again? And I think this is the answer. And I think this gives us an answer or conclusion to that question that's just so difficult at times is, why doesn't he do it always? And it's because in bringing people back to life. Jesus is ultimately pointing to his own resurrection, his own conquering of death, and the promise, the hope that he gives us that death has lost its sting if you're a follower of Jesus, that death has no victory if you believe in Jesus, that even though there has been appointed to all men a time that we might die, that those who believe in Jesus see that as passing from this world into eternal life, that we aren't dead, we're alive with Christ, that Jesus gives us these accounts of resurrection from the dead so that we might find, even in the midst of natural disaster and storms, and even in the midst of the demonic and the spiritual forces of this darkness, that even in the midst of disease and pain and problems, that even in the midst of death, that we might find a hope in one who has overcome, one who has conquered, one who is bigger than that, and came so that by trusting in him we might be saved and have life and life eternal through his name. Jesus Christ gives victory. It's as simple as that. I remember starting the bus back up and pulling back onto the road, and this 16-year-old weeping in the front seat. And as we pull up to his apartment, he gets up, he looks at me, he said, "It still hurts." I didn't have any words for him then. Really don't now. Other than this, I said, "It will. But you've got to trust in the one who overcame death, hell, and the grave." Church, that's what we're meant to do. Trust the one who overcame.